Picture this moment. 300,000 years ago, somewhere in the vast expanse of East Africa, lightning splits the sky and strikes a dead acacia tree. The trunk explodes into flames, and every living creature within miles does exactly what evolution programmed them to do. They run. Every creature except one. Her name was probably something we couldn't even pronounce today, but let's call her Carla. She's a young mother, maybe 20 years old if she's lucky, because 20 was old age back then. She's got a toddler clinging to her hip and another child hiding behind her legs. And when that tree erupts in fire, when every instinct screams at her to flee, Carla does something that will echo through 300 millennia of human history. She walks toward the flames. Now, think about that for a second. This isn't some Hollywood moment where the hero dramatically strides through explosions. This is a Stone Age woman making a decision that goes against 3 billion years of evolutionary programming. Fire meant death. Fire meant running. But somehow, in that primitive brain that was really no different from yours or mine, a spark of genius ignited. Maybe she'd seen fire before, watched it burn itself out safely. Maybe she'd noticed how animals fled from it, creating temporary zones of safety. We'll never know her exact reasoning, but we know what she did next because it changed everything. Carla grabbed a burning branch. She carried that flame back to her cave, and within hours, her small tribe had discovered something that would separate humans from every other species on Earth. Not just warmth, though imagine the luxury of being warm in a world where cold meant death. Not just light, though picture being able to see the eyes of predators before they saw you. No, Carla's descendants discovered that fire was a tool. They learned to harden the tips of wooden spears in flames, turning simple sticks into weapons that could pierce mammoth hide. They figured out how to use fire to drive entire herds of massive beasts off cliff edges, bringing down prey that weighed as much as a modern truck. They used smoke to preserve meat for journeys that would span continents. But here's where the story gets really interesting. By 150,000 years before Christ, Reso, and we're talking about a span of time that makes the entire recorded history of civilization look like a weekend. Humans had developed something extraordinary, not just the use of fire, but the first of what I call the 7 sacred techniques. The people living in Qafzeh cave in what we now call Israel had mastered shadow tracking. Now, this wasn't just following footprints in mud. This was reading the subtle interplay of light and darkness on cave walls to locate prey animals without ever leaving safety. Think about the level of environmental awareness this required. These people could tell you where a gazelle had bedded down for the night by observing how shadows fell differently across limestone surfaces. They understood that light behaves predictably, that it reveals secrets to those who know how to read its language. A shadow that fell just slightly wrong meant an animal had passed. A patch of reflected light indicated movement near water. They could track without being tracked, hunt without being hunted, all by reading the story that light and shadow wrote across their world every single day. The second technique emerged among the Blombos cave people of South Africa. An elder named, let's call him Toom, made a discovery that sounds like magic but was actually sophisticated physics. He found that certain stones sang differently when underground water flowed beneath them. Picture Toom, probably in his 40s and ancient by Stone Age standards, pressing his ear to various rocks and listening. Not just listening casually, but developing an acoustic sensitivity that would make modern sound engineers jealous. He learned that dry stone produced one kind of resonance when tapped, but stone with water flowing beneath it sang with a completely different tone. The children learned through what they called the finding game. They'd tap rocks in rhythm, training their ears to distinguish the hollow ring of dry earth from the deep, musical hum of water-bearing stone. And this knowledge spread along the ochre trade routes. Yes, these supposedly primitive people had trade networks spanning thousands of miles. Travelers exchanged survival techniques that were more valuable than any pigment or tool. But then came the test that nearly ended our species entirely. 70,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia exploded with the force of several thousand atomic bombs. The supervolcano plunged Earth into what scientists call a volcanic winter. The sky turned dark, temperatures plummeted, and suddenly, finding water and tracking prey weren't just useful skills. They were the difference between human extinction and survival. Picture this. Our entire species, reduced to perhaps 10,000 individuals scattered across Africa and parts of Asia. 10,000 people. That's smaller than most modern towns. Every single person alive today, all 8 billion of us, descended from that tiny group of survivors who somehow made it through the volcanic winter. And in that crucible of near extinction, the remaining 5 techniques crystallized. Persistence hunting, where hunters like those in the Kalahari learned something that sounds impossible. They could track an antelope for 3 straight days until the animal literally died of exhaustion. The invisible snares that could bring down mammoths using their own massive weight against them. Reading tomorrow's weather in the flight patterns of migrating birds. Extracting antibiotics from specific cave molds that glowed faintly green in the darkness. And bone-setting techniques that worked with the body's natural healing in ways that put our modern medicine to shame. These weren't primitive superstitions. These were sophisticated technologies encoded in human behavior rather than metal and circuits. Each technique required years to master and represented understanding of physics, biology, and environmental science that we're only beginning to appreciate today. But here's what makes this story both inspiring and tragic. These 7 techniques, shadow tracking, stone singing, persistence hunting, invisible snares, weather reading, natural antibiotics, and bone setting, weren't just survival skills. They were ways of being human. They connected our ancestors to their environment in ways so profound that losing them changed not just what we could do, but who we were. And lose them, we did. But that's a story that will make your blood boil when you understand how it happened and why the consequences still echo through our world today. 40,000 years before Christ, something remarkable happened to human survival: knowledge. It reached what we might call its golden age, time when our ancestors possessed skills so sophisticated that they seem almost supernatural to us today. This wasn't the dawn of human cleverness. This was high noon. In the Chauvet cave of France, a master tracker named Daru was teaching apprentices to see what others completely missed. Now, when I say teaching, I don't mean the way we teach today, sitting in classrooms, memorizing facts from books. These lessons happened in the field, over years, with lives hanging in the balance. Daru understood that shadows weren't just the absence of light, they were a language. Morning shadows revealed the night movements of prey animals. Think about this for a moment. While you slept safely in your cave, deer and elk had been moving through the forest, leaving traces that most people would never notice. But their passage had disturbed the fall of morning light in ways that told an entire story to those who knew how to read it. A. The blade of grass bent at just the wrong angle. A patch of moss slightly compressed. Morning shadows falling across these tiny disturbances created patterns that screamed, "A 6-point buck passed here 3 hours ago, moving northeast toward water, favoring his left rear leg." Afternoon light exposed hidden cave entrances that could mean the difference between shelter and freezing to death. Twilight shadows predicted predator ambush points, IA, because Daru knew that saber-toothed cats and cave bears used the same hunting strategies his people did, and those strategies were written in the language of light and shadow. His students spent years learning to read shadows like written language, not months, not weeks, years. Because understanding shadows meant understanding that survival wasn't about being stronger or faster than your enemies. It was about seeing danger before it saw you. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the water singers of Mesopotamia had perfected stone singing into an emulation art form that would make modern geological survey equipment look clumsy. A young woman named Uma could find water in the harshest desert conditions by placing her ear against sandstone at dawn, when temperature changes made the Earth's hidden songs clearest. She used hollow reeds to amplify vibrations and detect water 200 feet underground. 200 feet. That's deeper than a 20-story building is tall. Uma could press a reed against a rock face and tell you not just that water was flowing beneath, but how much water, how fast it was moving, and whether it was fresh or brackish. Entire tribes survived droughts that killed neighboring groups simply because they knew how to listen to the earth's hidden music. While others rationed their last drops of water and waited to die, Uma's people dug in spots that looked like any other patch of desert and found springs that could sustain them for months. But perhaps the most legendary development was in persistence hunting. Runners like Zaki of North Africa reached a level of endurance that sounds impossible until you understand the technique behind it. Zaki could maintain a steady pace for 72 hours. 3 full days of continuous movement, not running flat out, that would kill anyone, but maintaining a pace that was faster than any prey animal could sustain indefinitely. The technique required reading signs so minute that modern trackers miss them entirely. The depth of a hoof print could reveal the animal's level of fatigue. The angle of broken grass showed whether the creature was running in panic or simply moving from one feeding area to another. The spacing between tracks told you if the animal was breathing hard, if it was beginning to stumble, if its heart was starting to give out. Hunters like Zaki entered trance states where their breathing synchronized with their prey's. They became shadows that never tired, never stopped, never lost the trail. They could run down antelopes, deer, even horses, animals specifically evolved for speed and endurance, by understanding something profound about mammalian physiology that we're only rediscovering today. You see, most animals can run faster than humans, but they can't regulate their body temperature while running the way we can. They overheat, their hearts give out, and a human who knows how to pace himself, how to read the signs of exhaustion in his prey, how to enter that meditative state where running becomes as natural as breathing, that human becomes death itself, inevitable and unstoppable. And then there were the medicine women of Eastern Europe, working in caves that honeycombed the Carpathian Mountains. A master healer named Mira had identified 17 different healing molds, teaching her daughters to recognize them by their faint luminescence and their distinctive musty sweet smell. These weren't random folk remedies. Modern analysis of cave samples from this period shows that these molds produced primitive penicillin. Penicillin, the drug that saved millions of lives in the 20th century, discovered by our ancestors 30,000 years before Alexander Fleming, looked at a contaminated petri dish and changed the world. Mira knew that certain molds, when mixed with honey and applied to wounds, prevented the fever that killed more hunters than predators ever did. She understood which molds worked for which types of injuries, how to prepare them, how to store them for months without losing potency. Her knowledge kept warriors alive, who would have died from infections that modern antibiotics handle routinely. But here's what makes this era so remarkable, EMA, and so tragic in hindsight. These weren't isolated skills practiced by a few exceptional individuals. They were widespread, systematic bodies of knowledge passed down through generations of masters and apprentices. Shadow tracking wasn't magic practiced by one gifted tracker. It was a discipline with techniques, training, methods, and standards of excellence that entire cultures maintained. The water singers had schools. The persistence hunters had training regimens that would challenge modern Olympic athletes. The medicine women had catalogues of treatments more comprehensive than many medieval pharmacies. These were sophisticated technologies, encoded in human behavior rather than written in books or built into machines. And perhaps most importantly, these 7 techniques weren't separate skills. They were interconnected ways of understanding the world. A master shadow tracker also understood weather patterns, because light and atmospheric conditions were related. A water singer could often predict where to find medicinal molds, because cave acoustics and underground ecology were connected. A persistence hunter knew bone setting, because running for days without injury required understanding exactly how the human body worked under extreme stress. This was human knowledge at its peak, not in terms of tools or technology, but in terms of understanding our place in the natural world and our ability to thrive within it. Our ancestors could survive anywhere, in any conditions, with nothing more than their knowledge and their bodies. And then, In what might be the greatest tragedy in human history, we began to forget it all. 12,000 years ago, as the last ice sheets retreated and the world warmed into the climate we know today, something completely unexpected threatened human survival knowledge. Not a volcano, not a plague, not an invasion of hostile tribes. Success itself. Picture the village of Jericho rising from what had been nomad camps for thousands of years. For the first time in human history, people were choosing walls over wandering, grain storage over gathering, permanent settlement over the eternal journey. And within just 3 generations, the blink of an eye, in historical terms, children who once learned to read shadows were spending their days grinding wheat instead. The last shadow tracker of Jericho was an old man named Naram. He died mumbling about lost wisdom while his grandchildren celebrated their first harvest, completely oblivious to what they were losing. Naram had tried to teach them. He'd shown them how morning light revealed the passage of wild boar through the settlement's outskirts. He'd explained how twilight shadows could warn of predators approaching the grain stores. But his grandchildren looked at him the way you might look at someone trying to teach you how to make your own horseshoes. Why learn an obsolete skill when there were walls to protect them and stored grain to sustain them? The transition happened faster than anyone could have predicted. Young adults, seduced by the security of farming, openly mocked the old ways. And you can understand why, can't you? Why spend years learning to sing water from stones when you had wells that provided plenty? Why master the brutal art of persistence hunting when you had penned goats that offered easy meat whenever you needed it? A medicine woman named Safa watched her apprentices abandon the dangerous work of gathering molds from deep caves in favor of tending herbs in neat garden rows. What Safa understood, Topher understood, and what her apprentices didn't, was that cultivated plants lacked the defensive compounds that made wild medicines powerful. A garden herb might taste better and be easier to harvest, but it wouldn't save your life the way a cave mold could. But try explaining that to a young person who's never seen infection kill a healthy warrior in 3 days. Try convincing someone who's never been lost in trackless wilderness that reading shadows might matter. The knowledge seemed irrelevant because the conditions that made it necessary had disappeared, or seemed to have disappeared. And here's where the tragedy deepens. Each abandoned technique took with it vast networks of interconnected knowledge. When tribes stopped persistence hunting, they lost more than just a way to catch prey. They lost the meditative states that heightened awareness, the understanding of animal behavior, the intimate knowledge of how the human body responds to extreme endurance challenges. When they ceased reading bird migrations, they lost connection to seasonal rhythms that had guided human activity for hundreds of thousands of years. When they no longer sought cave molds, they lost understanding of entire underground ecosystems, airflow. The relationship between moisture, airflow, temperature, and the growth of life-saving microorganisms. The 7 techniques weren't just skills. They were ways of thinking, ways of being human in harmony with the natural world. Each one required a kind of attention and awareness that you simply couldn't maintain while focusing on agriculture and settlement building. Think about shadow tracking for a moment. To read shadows effectively, you needed to notice tiny changes in light patterns, variations so subtle that they required your complete attention. But farming demanded a different kind of focus, watching crops, monitoring weather for planting and harvesting, managing livestock. You couldn't do both. The mindset that made you a good farmer actively interfered with the mindset that made you a good tracker. By 8,000 years before Christ, entire regions had forgotten techniques their ancestors considered absolutely essential for survival. The last water singer in Anatolia died without finding a single student willing to spend the years necessary to learn stone singing. The final master of invisible mammoth traps in Europe took his knowledge to the grave because no one cared about hunting mammoths anymore. They were extinct anyway, killed off by climate change and human hunting pressure. In China, children played shadow games without understanding that their movements once meant the difference between life and death. The games preserved fragments of the techniques, but stripped of their survival context, they became mere entertainment. The great forgetting spread like a plague of comfort. Each generation knew less than the one before, needed less than the one before, and became less capable than the one before. And this wasn't happening in just one place. Agriculture was developing independently in multiple regions. Teai, the Middle East, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Teai, and everywhere it took hold, the same pattern repeated. Ancient knowledge disappeared not because it was wrong, but because it was no longer obviously necessary. Imagine being the last person in your community who knows how to find water in a desert. Your neighbors think you're clinging to superstition. Your own children roll their eyes when you try to teach them. The wells provide all the water anyone needs. Why should they learn to listen to stones? And then imagine a drought that lasts 3 years, and the wells run dry, and suddenly everyone realizes what they've lost. Except by then, it's too late. The knowledge died with you. This scenario played out thousands of times across thousands of communities as humanity transitioned from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. Each transition was logical. Each community made reasonable decisions based on their immediate circumstances. And each community lost something irreplaceable. The bone setters stopped teaching their techniques because people were getting injured less often in settled communities. The weather readers found their skills irrelevant when crops were stored against seasonal variations. The natural antibiotic knowledge became unnecessary when fewer people were getting infected wounds from hunting dangerous animals. But diseases still happened. Droughts still came. Accidents still occurred, and when they did, people died who would have survived if the old knowledge had been preserved. By 6,000 years before Christ, written language was beginning to appear in some settled communities. You might think this would have preserved the ancient techniques, but it had the opposite effect. Early writing focused on record-keeping for agriculture and trade, grain inventories, land ownership, commercial transactions. The survival techniques that had sustained humanity for hundreds of thousands of years weren't considered worth writing down. They were becoming folk memories, stories told by old people that young people dismissed as superstition. The greatest technological revolution in human history wasn't the development of agriculture or writing, it was the systematic forgetting of everything that had made us successful as a species. And the forgetting was just beginning. 2,000 years ago, Roman legions marched into the Sahara Desert, armed with the finest military technology of their age: bronze weapons, organized tactics, engineering knowledge that had built roads across Europe and aqueducts that supplied million-person cities. They died of thirst in the sand, while local Berber tribes found water using stone singing, techniques the civilized conquerors dismissed as primitive superstition. Think about the bitter irony of that. These Romans could build siege engines that knocked down city walls. They understood metallurgy, mathematics, and logistics, sophisticated enough to maintain an empire spanning 3 continents. But they couldn't find water in a desert where primitive people had been thriving for thousands of years, using knowledge that was older than their civilization. The pattern repeated again and again throughout history. During the medieval plague years, European cities lost 30 to 60% of their populations to the Black Death. Entire regions were depopulated, but scattered throughout the countryside, isolated communities survived by applying moldy bread to wounds and consuming fermented foods that we now know contained natural antibiotics. Their neighbors called it witchcraft. The church branded it heresy. And millions died who could have been saved by techniques our ancestors had been using for 30,000 years. Explorer after explorer died in territories where indigenous peoples thrived using fragments of the 7 techniques. Arctic expeditions froze to death while Inuit hunters read weather patterns in bird flight. Desert explorers died of thirst while Aboriginal Australians found water by listening to underground streams. Mountain climbers fell to their deaths while Himalayan villagers predicted avalanches by watching animal behavior. The contrast becomes even sharper in modern times, and frankly, it's almost embarrassing. In 1992, a survival expert named Michael Whitman died of dehydration in the Sahara Desert. This wasn't some weekend hiker who got lost. This was a professional with high-tech equipment, 9Z, GPS devices, satellite communications, water purification tablets, the works. His gear failed him, and he died of thirst. 50 miles away, Tuareg nomads were locating water sources by listening to stones, just as their ancestors had done for millennia. In 2008, 3 experienced hikers froze to death in the Scottish Highlands. These were people with modern cold weather gear, emergency beacons, and decades of hiking experience between them. They died because they couldn't read the signs that would have warned them of an incoming blizzard. Local shepherds, meanwhile, had moved their flocks to shelter 12 hours earlier based on bird migration patterns, BSE. Knowledge their grandfathers had passed down, fragments of techniques that were 40,000 years old. Our ancestors would have survived these situations easily, not because they were tougher than us, though they probably were, but because they knew things we've forgotten. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find fragments of the ancient knowledge scattered around the world, like pieces of a shattered mirror. Aboriginal Australians in the Central Desert still practice persistence hunting, though only the eldest remember why it works the way it does. They've lost the deep understanding of the meditative states and the physiological principles, but they can still run down kangaroos in ways that leave modern athletes speechless. In the Himalayas, village elders predict avalanches by watching bird behavior patterns, but they're not teaching these skills to their children anymore. Why learn to read bird flights when you can get weather reports on your cell phone? Except cell towers fail, satellites go dark, and weather reports are often wrong. Bird behavior patterns developed over millions of years of evolution rarely are. Russian babushkas, MAO, grandmothers, still apply bread mold to cuts and scrapes, not knowing they're administering antibiotics their ancestors discovered in caves. They just know it works, the same way their mothers knew, and their grandmothers before them. But they're not teaching the technique to their granddaughters, who have access to modern medicine and think the old ways are embarrassing superstition. The irony cuts deep when you look at modern survival culture. Preppers spend thousands of dollars stockpiling gear while completely ignoring skills that require no equipment whatsoever. They trust GPS devices over bird navigation, water filtration systems over stone singing, first aid kits stocked with modern antibiotics over natural medicines that grow in their own backyards. They build bunkers filled with freeze-dried food and ammunition, but they can't read weather patterns or track animals, or find water without technology. When their batteries die and their equipment fails, and it will fail, they'll be helpless in ways their ancestors never were. And here's what really should keep you awake at night. Climate change and social instability are making ancient knowledge more relevant than ever before. Supply chains that deliver antibiotics to your local pharmacy can be disrupted by everything, from pandemics to wars to economic collapse. GPS satellites can be knocked out by solar flares or cyber attacks. Weather prediction systems depend on complex technological infrastructure that becomes more vulnerable every year. But indigenous communities that have maintained fragments of the 7 techniques show consistently higher survival rates in natural disasters than their prepared neighbors with bunkers full of gadgets. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, the people who survived best weren't those with the most emergency supplies. They were those who could read environmental signs, who understood how to find clean water in contaminated areas, who knew how to treat injuries and infections without modern medical facilities. The 7 techniques are still out there, waiting for rediscovery. Not as museum curiosities or interesting historical footnotes, but as living skills that could save your life tomorrow. Shadow tracking teaches environmental awareness that no night vision goggle can match. It develops a kind of attention that notices threats and opportunities that technology-dependent people miss entirely. Stone singing develops acoustic sensitivity that can locate not just water, but caves for shelter, hollow trees for food storage, underground spaces that might indicate anything from natural gas deposits to unstable ground. The technique works because it's based on physics that hasn't changed in millions of years. Persistence hunting builds endurance and mental resilience that goes far beyond physical fitness. The meditative states involved in successful persistence hunting create psychological toughness that helps people survive any kind of extreme stress, not just multi-day chases across trackless wilderness. Natural antibiotics work when supply chains fail and hospitals are overloaded. The compounds our ancestors discovered in cave molds and plant extracts are often more effective than synthetic drugs against antibiotic-resistant bacteria, because they evolved as part of ongoing biological warfare between microorganisms. Weather reading provides advance warning when satellite systems go dark and meteorologists are wrong. Birds and animals have been predicting weather changes for millions of years. Their behaviors are often more accurate than computer models because they're responding to environmental cues we haven't learned to measure yet. These aren't primitive fallbacks for when civilization collapses. They're sophisticated technologies that were developed over hundreds of thousands of years by the most successful species in Earth's history. They're encoded in human behavior rather than built into machines, which makes them infinitely more reliable than any gadget you can buy. Our ancestors' greatest invention wasn't fire or the wheel or agriculture. It was knowledge itself, systematic understanding of how to thrive as human beings in the natural world, refined over 300,000 years of trial and error, passed down through countless generations of masters and apprentices. We threw it away in a few centuries of agricultural abundance. We traded the accumulated wisdom of humanity's entire evolutionary history for the temporary security of settled civilization. And now, as that security looks increasingly fragile, we're beginning to realize what we lost. The knowledge is still out there, scattered in fragments across isolated communities, encoded in folk practices that people follow without understanding why they work. It can be rediscovered, relearned, and passed on to new generations who might need it more than we can imagine. The question is whether we'll remember in time, or whether we'll have to relearn everything the hard way, through the same brutal process of trial and error that taught our ancestors in the first place. The choice is ours, the clock is ticking, and somewhere in the back of your mind, you can probably hear the whisper of ancient knowledge, waiting for someone wise enough to listen.